everybody, welcome to another lesson of learning Japanese. Today we're going to be covering the basic guidelines on how to use quotations in the Japanese language, and more specifically the difference between direct quotations and indirect quotations. So if you're here to learn how to quote people in Japanese and not be held accountable for any of your words, then you've come to the right place. So the Japanese language, very much like the English language, has two different types of quotations. We have direct quotations and we have indirect quotations. So just to give a universal refresher for both languages, when we're using direct quotations, we're basically quoting verbatim or word for word. We're saying exactly what the person who originally spoke the quote said. And so in the English language, when we're doing this, we use punctuation marks called quotation marks, and we put them at the beginning and the end of the quote. In the Japanese language, the corresponding punctuation marks that we're going to use are called kagikakko, or for short, just kagi, and they look like this. Text should be somewhere in the video. On the other hand, when we're using indirect quotation marks, we're not doing a verbatim word for word quotation. We're kind of just paraphrasing what the person originally said, and thus no indicative punctuation mark is required. But now then you might be asking, well, how do we tell the difference between a direct quotation and an indirect quotation in the Japanese language? Because in the English language, we know it's a direct quotation mark when there are quotation marks, and we know it's an indirect quotation when you basically use the word that right before the quotation. And that is definitely true. In the English language, you can say something along the lines of, he said that he's not coming to practice today, and that'll be an indirect quotation, and you can kind of realize that it's an indirect quotation the moment that the word that is uttered. And when you're using direct quotations in the English language, it's a bit harder to tell if you're listening and you're hearing the quotation being said, but if you're reading it, then you know right away that it's a direct quotation because of the quotation marks. And for the Japanese language, like I said, it has the equivalent of quotation marks, which are the kagikakko, but it doesn't use the Japanese equivalent of the word that to indicate indirect quotations when they're being used. However, we do have a way to know if it's a direct quotation or an indirect quotation, because in the Japanese language, when we're using either direct quotations or indirect quotations, we use the quotation marker to, and this is just the particle to, and it's going to appear after the actual quotation, and that's going to be pretty similar to the word that in the English language. That tells you that an indirect quotation is going to happen because it's always in front of it, but this time to is going to be after the quotation, and it's going to denote a quotation in general, so it can be direct or indirect. And since we have that, then now we just know if there's no kagikakko, then it's going to be an indirect quotation mark, and if there are kagikakko, then it's going to be a direct quotation. So that makes it pretty simple, but now we're going to move on, and we're going to have to explore some of the additional nuances that the Japanese language has that makes it still a bit slightly more complicated to distinguish between direct quotations and indirect quotations than it is for the English language. And we're also going to go through one or two more guidelines that applies to both direct quotations and indirect quotations. So our first significant tidbit to look out for here is that Japanese difference between plain form and polite form, basically. So how this extends into our grammatical usage for quotations is that if the original quote was in the polite form and you're directly quoting it, then it's going to stay in the polite form. It's going to stay in whatever form it was used in. However, indirect quotations always have to be in the plain form. So if the person originally said something that was in the polite form, then we're going to have to alter it ourselves. We're going to use some creative control, and we're going to turn it into its respective plain form. So for our really simple example demonstrating this, 彼女は楽しかったですと言った. And this is going to be a sentence using a direct quotation, and what it translates to is basically, she said it was fun. We break down the sentence bit by bit. We just have 彼女, that's the subject. We have wa, that's the particle marking 彼女as the subject of the sentence. Then we have the direct quotation, so it's basically going to be a sentence within the sentence, and the simple quotation is just 楽しかったです. And that, of course, is the polite past form of the adjective 楽しい, which means fun. So we turn that into its ta form, so 楽しい turns into 楽しかった, and then we add des to make it polite. So it was fun. Then we have the particle to, marking that as the quotation. Then we have the ta form of the verb you, which means to say, and so ita is said. So she said it was fun. Now we want to analyze the indirect version of this sentence, and so we have the line 彼女は楽しかったと言った. And you won't notice from me just saying the line, but you should see in the text that's superimposed on my face right now that we dropped the quotation marks or the kagikakko because this is a indirect quotation and it doesn't use those. And then we break down this sentence, and again, we have kanojo as the subject, so she, we have the wa marking her as the subject, and then we have our indirect quotation here, and it's just going to be tanoshikatta because this is going to be the plain form. So we can't have the word des in this quotation because we can't have polite form in indirect quotation. So we simply remove the des, and then we follow with another to because this is going to be the particle that marks a quotation regardless of whether it's a direct quotation or an indirect quotation, and then again we follow with ita to mean said. So she said that it was fun. And so that's demonstrating the first extra guideline that we have. The indirect quotations cannot be in the polite form, they have to be in the plain form. So regardless of whether the original thing said that you want to quote was in the polite form or the plain form, you might have to adjust it yourself to use it in an indirect quotation. Our next guideline is going to apply to direct quotations and indirect quotations in the same way, and basically it just says that even though quotations are basically subordinate clauses because they are sentences in and of themselves within the main sentence being said by the current speaker, those sentences or subordinate clauses, those quotations are going to be using the particle wa as opposed to the particle ga, which is typically used for subordinate clauses within a sentence. And so like I said, this applies to both direct quotations and indirect quotations, and it's basically just an exception to a grammatical rule that we've already had knowledge of, or we should have had knowledge of, and again, that is that subordinate clauses in a sentence use the particle ga as opposed to the particle wa. So now let's just go through a pair of examples demonstrating that. And so for our first line, we're going to be using direct quotation version, and our line is kanojo wa kono ega wa sugoku omoshiroi to itta. And so what this line will translate to is she said this movie is super interesting. And so let's break down the sentence bit by bit. First up, we have kanojo, which means she or her. We have wa marking her as the topic of the sentence. Then we have our quote, and it's just going to be kono ega wa sugoku omoshiroi. And so kono means this, it's modifying the word after it, which is ega, which means movie. Right after movie, we have the particle wa, and this is the thing that we're looking out for here. We're using wa again in the sentence, even though we already used it once in the beginning to mark kanojo as the topic of the sentence, but since this is a quote in the sentence, we're still allowed to use wa, so this is fine. Then we have sugoku, which is an adverb that means really or very, and it's going to be modifying the adjective right after it, which is omoshiroi, which is interesting. So really interesting, very interesting, super interesting. Altogether, the quote in the sentence reads, this movie is super interesting. Kono ega wa sugoku omoshiroi. Right after the quote, of course, we put the particle to mark it as a quotation. Then we have the verb that the kanojo did, which is ita, which again translates to said. So she said this movie is super interesting. And so yeah, hopefully that explanation of why we used wa in that sentence twice makes sense. But if it doesn't, let's go through it again, because we're going to go through the indirect quotation version of the sentence, and it's going to be the exact same thing, except for it doesn't have the quotation marks or the kagikakko. But verbally, it's going to be the exact same thing. Kanojo wa kono ega wa sugoku omoshiroi to itta. And this is going to be the exact same thing in Japanese, but when we translate to English, instead of she said this movie is super interesting, it's going to be she said that this movie is super interesting. But the key idea that we're trying to elaborate upon here is that we use the topic marker wa twice in the sentence, and we can do that even though quotations are technically subordinate clauses because they are an exception to that rule because they're just quotations.